If you grew up in Britain, an ever-ready lived somewhere in your house, in the torch in the drawer, the wireless on the shelf, the toy on the carpet on Christmas morning. By the end of the 60s, it held close to 90% of the British battery market. Its works at Tanfield Lea in the Durham coalfield was the largest battery factory in Europe. It came through 2 world wars, through the Blitz, when a bomb flattened one of its factories and the work simply moved on, through the Depression, through rationing, through the loss of the coal and the steel all around it. It outlasted every rival. And then, after nearly a century of making, the last battery works in Britain fell silent. How does a name that survived everything the century could throw at it simply vanish from the shelves? That's what this is about. Chapter 1. The Immigrant and the Flashlight. The story starts a long way from County Durham. It starts in New York, in the last years of the 19th century, with a man who'd already been a cigar seller, a restaurateur, a jeweler and a maker of novelty lights, and who was about to stumble into an invention that would end up in almost every home in Britain. His name was Conrad Hubert, though that wasn't the name he was born with. He'd been born Akiba Horowitz, in Minsk, in the Russian Empire. He came to America in 1891, a Jewish emigrant of around 35, fleeing the persecutions of the Tsar. And like a great many who landed at that time, he changed his name at the door of the new country and set about trying one thing after another: a cigar store, a restaurant, a jewellery shop, a dozen small ventures, and none of them quite took. He was, by every account, a man who could sell. What he lacked was the thing to sell. He found it almost by accident. It was a gimmick, really. A small electric light you pin to your scarf or your necktie, glowing at parties, run off a little battery hidden in your pocket. Ridiculous, and rather wonderful, and people wanted it. That novelty gave Hubert his first real money, and with it, he did the shrewdest thing of his life. He started buying patents. First the patent for an electric bicycle lamp, and then the patent that would change everything. The man who actually invented that one was British. David Mizell, born in England, working in New York, had filed his design in 1898, and in January of the following year, the United States Patent Office granted it, a tubular, handheld electric device. Strip away the language of the patent clerk, and what Mizell had made was breathtakingly simple. A paper tube, a couple of dry cells stacked inside it, end to end, a small bulb at the top and a little brass reflector to gather the light and throw it forward. Press the contact, and a beam of clean, cold, flameless light reached out into the dark. A torch. Mizell assigned his invention to Hubert, and Hubert put it on sale under a trademark that promised exactly what a person wanted from a light in the dark. A light that would work the instant they needed it, every time, ever ready. Now, Hubert was a salesman before he was anything else, and he understood something that the engineers never did, that a product has to be seen. So he gave his flashlights away to the policemen of New York City. And there is no advertising on earth quite like a beat constable shining your product down a dark alley, every night of the week, in front of the whole city. Sales did not so much grow as detonate. By the end of 1899, Hubert had a factory on Centre Street, 10,000 square feet of it, 60 people turning out torches and the batteries to feed them. In 1905, he renamed the whole concern the American Ever-Ready Company. In time, it would fold into the National Carbon Company, and then into an industrial giant called Union Carbide, and the name would be shortened, in the American style, to a single word: Ever-Ready. Hubert himself died a rich man, one of those American fortunes built out of nothing but nerve and a good eye for what people didn't yet know they needed. But that's the American story. And this is not the American story. Because in 1901, an ocean away, a separate company was quietly registered in Britain. At first, it did the obvious thing. It sold Hubert's American novelties to British customers, importing the party lights and the little torches, with the dry batteries assembled on British premises and stamped with that same reassuring name. In 1906, it grew up and took a name of its own, the British Ever-Ready Electrical Company. And here is the detail that almost nobody who grew up with those batteries ever knew, the detail on which this entire tragedy eventually turns. From about 1904 onwards, the British company and the American company had nothing whatsoever to do with one another. Same name, same idea, same origin, but two entirely separate firms, on two sides of the Atlantic, each going its own way, each owning that name in its own half of the world. The British business was registered as a public company in 1913 and floated on the London Stock Exchange the year after, in 1914, fully independent, fully British, master of the ever-ready name across Britain and its empire. It was no longer an outpost of anyone. It was its own country's company. Hold on to that fact, because the name that would come to feel as British as a torch, kept under the stairs, had begun life as an American import that cut itself loose and made itself British. And the story of how it fell is, in the cruelest imaginable symmetry, the story of how it was sold back to where it came from. By the late 1920s, the British company had a chairman named Magnus Goodfellow, who steered both the ever-ready company and the finance house that sat behind it. And the business Goodfellow was steering had landed, more by luck than by genius, on exactly the right side of history. In those early decades, the British company built itself on precisely the things a half-electrified country could not do without. Torches by the crate-load, bicycle lamps, white at the front, red at the rear, for the millions who pedalled to work down unlit lanes before dawn, hand lamps for the miner and the night watchman, and beneath all of it, the cells that fed them. Ever Ready learned something early that it would never forget, and that would in the end become both the making and the undoing of it. The real money was never in the lamp. It was in the battery the lamp swallowed, again and again, week after week, for as long as the lamp was kept. Sell a man a torch, once. Sell him the light for it forever. Consider what a battery actually solved. Before the dry cell, before Michel's torch, portable light meant flame. A candle, an oil lamp, a hissing gas mantle, and flame, in a wooden house or a coal-dusty cottage full of children, meant the constant low dread of burning the place to the ground. Portable electricity, meanwhile, meant a wet cell, a heavy glass jar of acid that leaked, corroded whatever it touched, and could not be tipped or carried without care. A German chemist named Karl Gassner had patented the answer back in 1886. A dry cell, the acid held fast in a paste that would not spill. Put Gassner's dry cell inside Michel's tube, and for the first time in human history, you had safe, portable, on-demand light that a child could carry up to bed. And Britain, of all the countries on earth, was the perfect market for it, because Britain electrified slowly. The great cities got their main supply soon enough, but whole swathes of the countryside, the villages, the farms, the pit rows strung along the valleys, waited decades for the wires to reach them, which meant a vast, hungry, permanent market for anything that could run on a battery. Torches, bicycle lamps, and before very long, the machine that would make Ever Ready rich beyond anything a novelty light salesman from Minsk could have dreamed of. The wireless. Chapter 2. The Empire of Dry Cells. Here's a fact that sounds impossible now. In the years between the wars, the radio in the corner of the British front room did not plug into the wall. It ran on batteries, great heavy things, a high-tension battery to feed the valves their power and a low-tension one to warm them, and they went flat, steadily, the way a fire burns down. And so a ritual grew up in every town in the land. You carried your dead battery to the shop, and you swapped it for a charged one, and you did it again the week after, and the week after that, for as long as you owned a wireless. It was a subscription to the age of broadcasting, paid in zinc and acid. In every high street there was a shop with a rack of them behind the counter, and a boy out the back to do the swaps, and a family's whole evening, the news, the dance bands, the voice of the king, depended on whether father had remembered to take the flat one down to be exchanged. In 1934 alone, more than 15 million radio batteries were sold across Britain. 15 million, for a nation of radios that couldn't reach a socket. British Ever Ready sat squarely in the middle of that river of money, and it used the current to grow. It didn't grow gently. It grew by swallowing its neighbours whole. In 1925, it bought the F&M Company of Wolverhampton, a firm that had spent the Great War turning out torches, batteries and searchlights, and that would swell, under Ever Ready's ownership, to employ nearly 3,000 people. Then the company turned on the wireless trade itself. Between 1928 and 1934, it took control of Listen, one of the great names in radio sets and components, a firm with 3 factories scattered across London and a workforce some 2,800 strong. By 1932, Ever Ready stood confirmed as the leading maker of dry batteries in the country, And that same year it bought the old AJS motorcycle works in Wolverhampton, the Canal Works, and remade it into one of the great torch-making centres of Britain. 3 years on, it went into building the radios as well as the batteries that ran them, in partnership with Pi, and it would keep making wirelesses right up to 1964. By the middle of the 1930s, Eveready had achieved something that ought to give a person pause. It had made itself so dominant that its one serious rival in the storage business, the Chloride Company, simply agreed to divide the map. In 1937, the two firms shook hands on a carve-up. Chloride would not make the ordinary dry batteries and would buy them instead from Eveready. Eveready would not make the rechargeable ones and would buy those from Chloride. A gentleman's agreement not to compete. It's the kind of arrangement that tells you, more clearly than any balance sheet, just how sure of itself a company had become. Sure enough that it no longer thought of the future as something that might arrive uninvited. Then the war came, and Eveready did what British industry did. It turned to the fight. Back in the First War, the F&M side of the business had made the military torches men carried in the trenches, the bullseye lamps, fitted from 1917 with Morse keys, so a soldier could signal across no man's land in the dark without making a sound. In the Second War, the Lisson factory in Islington held a ministry contract to build and repair the wireless comfort sets that kept the forces in touch with home. And then, in 1941, a German bomb found the Islington works and flattened it. The work did not stop. It picked itself up and moved, out to Amersham first, then north to the Wolverhampton factories, and the batteries and the signalling gear kept coming without a real break. Eveready powered the torches and the field radios and the signal lamps of a nation at war, and it came out the far side of that war stronger than it had gone in. That is worth remembering, later, when the thing that finally kills the company turns out not to be a bomb or a blitz or an enemy at all. And it kept buying. In 1957 it reached across the Channel and took over Damon, one of the proud old German battery names, and Superpila in Italy, assembling a battery empire that now spanned the continent. In 1962 it absorbed the dry battery business of Siemens Edison. Piece by piece, over 60 years, a company that had begun by importing American party lights had turned itself into the thing that powered British life. The torch in the kitchen drawer, the lamp on the front of the bicycle, the wireless on the shelf. All of it, Eveready. By the 1960s, the company had arrived at a happy sort of problem. It was selling more batteries than its scattered old factories could comfortably make. It needed somewhere new, somewhere enormous, a single purpose-built works that could pour out cells by the million and stamp the whole country's supply in one place. The only question was where to put it. The answer came out of politics as much as commerce. Through the 1960s, the government was using grants and incentives to steer new factories towards the parts of Britain that were losing their old industries. The coalfields, the steel towns, the places where the work was draining out of the ground and the men were being turned out of the pits. County Durham was precisely such a place, and so, in 1968, in a former colliery landscape just north of the town of Stanley, Eveready opened the largest battery factory it had ever built, said at the time to be the largest in all of Europe. The cabinet minister Anthony Crosland, then president of the Board of Trade, travelled up to open it himself. There were speeches, there was fanfare. There was, in a corner of the country that had spent years being told its best days were behind it, a real and unfamiliar feeling that the future had just walked in through the gate. The place was called Tanfield Lea. Chapter 3. The Works in the Coalfield. To understand what Tanfield Lea meant, you have to understand where it stood. This is Derwentside, in the northwest of County Durham, a landscape written over, line by line, by coal. The Tanfield Moor Colliery. The old Tanfield branch line, one of the earliest railways in the entire world, laid down more than 2 centuries ago to carry coal to the Tyne. For generation upon generation, the men here went down the pit, as their fathers had, and their fathers before them, in an unbroken chain that stretched back further than anyone could quite remember. And then, one by one, the pits began to close. The work that had made the place, that had built the terraces and filled the working men's clubs, and given a man a wage and a name, and a reason to get up before light, went quiet. A colliery closing is not just a workplace lost, it is a way of understanding yourself, taken away. So when the battery works opened in 1968, it opened into a community that knew exactly what it was to lose an industry, and was aching for a new one, The men who walked through those gates were, overwhelmingly, the sons of miners. A good number of them had been miners themselves. They came up off the coal and onto the battery line, trading the dark and the danger and the water underground for the clatter and the chemical tang of the factory floor. And for the first 20 years of the work's life, that shop floor was a place of men and men alone. Women were not taken on there until 1988, an astonishing thing to record about a factory that had by then been running for 2 decades, and a measure of just how completely Tanfield Lea had inherited not only the labour of the coalfield, but its whole culture, its habits, its idea of who did what. The pit had come up out of the ground and started making torches, and what these men made was the humblest, most ordinary object imaginable: the zinc carbon cell, the classic dry battery, the blue and red cylinder that lived in every torch and every toy in Britain. Watch one being born, though, and the ordinary thing turns strange and rather beautiful, and you begin to feel the place. It starts with a little cup of zinc, drawn and pressed into a can. That can does 2 jobs at once, which is the quiet genius of the design. It's the container that holds everything in, and it is also the negative pole of the battery, slowly giving itself up, dissolving cell by cell to release its power. The inside of the can gets lined with a paste separator, starch or a treated paper, a thin wet skin. Then comes the heart of the thing, lowered into the centre, a moulded black plug, a mix of manganese dioxide and carbon packed hard around a single carbon rod, and that rod, standing up through the middle, is the positive pole. In goes the electrolyte, a salty paste, ammonium chloride in the early years, later a cleaner zinc chloride recipe that leaked less and lasted longer, and at the very end the cell is capped and sealed, with one tiny vent left open, because a battery generates gas as it works, and the gas has to have somewhere to go or the whole thing bursts. Do all of that a few million times a week, in unbroken sequence, and you have a factory. A young lad arriving for his first shift would know the works before he was through the gate, and he'd know it by his nose. The metallic bite of the zinc, the fine black dust of the carbon and the manganese, the sort that finds its way under a man's fingernails and into the weave of his overalls and never quite comes out again, so that battery men could be picked out on a Saturday night by the faint grey shadow that stayed on their hands. And underneath it all, sharp and unmistakable and catching at the back of the throat, the acrid ammonia of the electrolyte. Over the top of every smell, the noise, the relentless mechanical clatter of the can-forming presses and the assembly lines, stamping and filling and sealing without pause, a sound with no gaps in it at all, running through the day and on through the night in shifts. It was nothing like the pit, and yet to men who'd come off the coal, there was something in it they recognised, the shared rhythm of a place that made a real thing you could hold in your hand, the mate working beside you on the line, and the wage packet on a Friday that turned all of it into a life. And the volume of it beggared belief. A dry battery is a small thing, a thing a child loses down the back of a settee. But Tanfield Lea did not make them one at a time. It made them in their millions, the lines never stopping, 3 shifts round the clock. The day men handing over to the back shift and the back shift to the night, so that at 3 in the morning, when the coalfield outside was black and silent and asleep, the works still blazed and clattered and poured out cells into the dark. A man could set his watch by the change of shift. Whole streets emptied and filled to its timetable. In a place that had lost the pit hooter, the battery works had quietly become the thing that told the community what o'clock it was. At its height, in the 1970s, around 950 people worked at Tanfield Lea. It was the largest employer for miles in every direction, and the work ran in families, exactly the way the pit work had. A father on one line, a son on another, an uncle away in the stores, a cousin on the forklifts. When Anthony Crosland cut that ribbon in '68, he had not simply opened a factory. He had handed a wounded community a second chance to be about something, and for a good long while, it truly looked like a chance that would last. Chapter 4. A Blue and Red Nation. Nobody would have called it a famous factory. No one outside County Durham could have told you where Tanfield Lea was, or what it looked like, or a single name of anyone who worked there. And yet, almost every person in Britain owned what it made, and most of them called that thing by the wrong name, because for the better part of a century, an ever ready simply meant a battery. The brand had swallowed the word. It was in the torch you kept for the power cuts, and the one your father kept in the glove box of the car. It was in the transistor radio a teenager pressed to one ear under the bedclothes long after they were meant to be asleep. It was in the doorbell, and the mantel clock, and the box camera, and the toy that whirred across the carpet on Christmas morning, until mid-afternoon it slowed and stopped, and a parent went looking for a spare. That blue and red cylinder was so completely woven into ordinary life that people stopped seeing it altogether, the way you stop seeing a thing that has simply always been there. There was no higher compliment a product could be paid. When a battery died, a British household did not say it needed a battery. It said it needed an ever-ready, even when the dead one on the kitchen table bore some rival's name, even when the shopkeeper handed over something else entirely. The name had stopped being a brand and become a category, the way a vacuum cleaner became a Hoover, and every time somebody said it, without thinking, standing at a counter or rummaging in a drawer, they were paying an unwitting tribute to a factory in County Durham they had never heard of and would never see. By the end of the 1960s, the company held something close to 90% of the entire British battery market. 90. It was not a leading brand. It was, very nearly, the only brand. A near-total grip on the small hidden power source that ran a modern household. So complete was that hold that in 1974, the Monopolies Commission was sent in to examine it, and found the company controlling around 80% of the market for the ordinary zinc-carbon battery. And having looked at all of it, the Commission concluded that Eveready had not, in fact, abused its position. It hadn't needed to. It was simply, overwhelmingly, unarguably, on top. Behind that dominance sat a real engine of invention. Down in Tottenham, in North London, on St. Anne's Road, the company ran a vast research laboratory, a place full of chemists and engineers whose entire working lives were spent trying to make the next battery a little better than the last. There were competitors, of course, scrapping over the sliver of the market that Eveready did not already own. Vidor, founded by the very man who had built up Listen before Eveready absorbed it. Drydex. The old established names, Exide, Crompton Parkinson, Rayovac. But not one of them frightened anybody in the Eveready boardroom. They were the also-rans in a race that had, to every appearance, already been run and won. The threat, when it finally came, would not come from any of them. It would come from America, and it would arrive dressed in a new chemistry. And to have seen it coming, you would have had to be watching a laboratory in Ohio in the middle of the 1950s. There, a Canadian-born chemist named Louis Urry, working for the very same Union Carbide that had long ago absorbed the American Eveready, built a battery that ran on a wholly different recipe. An alkaline cell. It cost a good deal more to make than the zinc-carbon cell that Britain ran on. But it lasted far, far longer, and a company called PR. Mallory would take Urry's idea, turn it into a finished product, and give that product a name that promised the one quality a longer-lasting battery could offer. Duracell. For now, though, through the golden years, none of that troubled the works in the coalfield in the slightest. The lines ran day and night. The batteries went out by the lorry load to every corner shop and hardware store and electrical dealer in the land, and came back only as money. And what that money built, in Tanfield Lea and Stanley and the villages around them, was something a balance sheet has no column for. It built security, the deepest, quietest kind, the kind a mining community had learned never to take for granted. A man on the battery line could get a mortgage because the manager at the bank knew the works wasn't going anywhere. He could plan. He could tell his boy, without any particular drama, that there'd be a start for him at the works when he left school, the way once there'd have been a start at the pit. The clubs and the chapels and the leak shows and the Saturday football all ran, in the end, on the same current that ran the assembly lines. On the simple fact of steady wages, steadily paid, to hundreds of families in a place that had been told, not so long before, that its usefulness was finished. The works gave the coalfield back its self-respect. And self-respect, once a place has tasted losing it, is not a small thing to be handed a second time. The men who worked there were proud of the work, too, in the understated way of that part of the country. No one made speeches about it. But they knew that the torch on the lifeboat, the battery in the pit lamp, the cell that ran the wireless in a front room 300 miles south, had been made by their hands, in their town, and had gone out into the country carrying, invisibly, a little of the coalfield with it. And in Tanfield Lea and Stanley, and the villages strung along the old colliery roads, the works had done the very thing that everyone had hoped it would do when Crosland came up to open it. It had put the wage back into the packet. Men who had feared, when the pits shut, that they would never work again, that they would sit in the club at 50 with nowhere to be, had 20 good years on the battery line instead. The clubs stayed open. The families stayed put. The children were fed and shod and sent to school on battery money. And the sons of miners raised sons of their own, who assumed, quite naturally, that there would always be work at the works, the way once there had always been coal. Chapter 5. The Battery That Was Never Built. Every fall has a summit, and this was the summit, a near-total grip on the home market, a brand name that had become the everyday word for the product itself, a gleaming new megaworks in the northeast, opened by a cabinet minister, running flat out around the clock. From the top of that hill, in the early 1970s, a man standing in the ever-ready boardroom could look out across the whole enterprise and see nothing but clear sky. The company had survived 2 world wars. It had survived the Depression and the Blitz and the long grey years of rationing. It had bought up its rivals across 2 countries and simply outlasted the rest at home. What exactly was there to fear? Only this. The future of the battery was not the battery they made. Lewis Urry's alkaline cell, the one that Duracell was now built upon, was the coming thing, and anyone who studied the numbers could see it. It was dearer to manufacture, yes, but people would gladly pay more for a battery that lasted. The market for it was growing every single year, and it carried a far fatter margin than the cheap zinc-carbon cells on which Eveready's whole fortune had been built. The clever money could read the direction of travel. And the question, for a company that dominated the old technology so utterly, was whether it had the nerve to invest in the new one, to spend real money on the very thing that would, in time, devour its own best-selling product. And here is the detail that turns this from a business story into a tragedy. Eveready could see it too. In 1973, in that great laboratory at Tottenham, the company's own chemists built a long-life alkaline battery of their own. They made the thing. They held the future in their hands, on a workbench in North London, years before the loss ever began. This was not a company blindsided by a technology it failed to understand. It understood the technology perfectly. It had built the technology. The alkaline cell that would, within a decade, begin to strip away everything Eveready owned, had been sitting in the company's own laboratory, working, proven, ready, and it never went into production. The reasons would have seemed entirely sensible at the time, the way ruinous decisions so often do, in the moment, in the room. There seemed no earthly sense in pouring money into an expensive new cell when the cheap old one still owned nearly the whole of the country and printed profit every quarter. No sense in cannibalizing a near monopoly to chase a market that was, for the moment, still small. So the alkaline battery was quietly set aside, filed away, left on the shelf. The company that had invented its own future looked at that future squarely and chose, reasonably and calmly, not to build it, and in doing so left the door standing wide open for an American rival to walk straight through. Nobody at Tanfield Lea knew any of this. There was no reason they should. The lines were running, the batteries were selling, the wage was in the packet on a Friday, and the club was open on a Saturday. And up on that summit, in the clear air of the early 70s, the works looked every bit as permanent as the hills that stood around it. But the decision had already been made. And downhill, far out of sight of the coalfield, in boardrooms these men would never enter, the ground had quietly begun to move. Chapter 6. The Weight of Being Everywhere. The trouble with owning almost everything is that there is only one direction left to travel. By the middle of the 1970s, Eveready's dominance had quietly hardened into a trap. A near-total grip on a market gives a company enormous profit and almost no reason to change, and change, in the battery trade, was the one thing coming that could not be bought off or bought out. The company sat on a mountain of cash thrown up by a cheap, simple, mature product. And mature is only a gentler word for what zinc carbon was becoming. It was a chemistry beginning to die, slowly, from the top of the market down, and the men in charge, comfortable on their mountain, kept mistaking the height of it for safety. The first mistake was quiet, and its full weight only becomes visible from here, looking back. In 1977, the company sold its shareholding in Mallory. the American firm behind Duracell. Think about that for a moment. Eveready had once held a stake in the very company that made the alkaline battery, the exact technology that was about to inherit the future. And it let it go. In a single transaction, it cut itself free of the chemistry it had chosen not to build in its own laboratory, as though a man had sold his share of a gold mine the week before they struck the seam. Then the cracks began to show at Tanfield Lea itself, and they showed in the most old-fashioned way imaginable. The works had grown dangerously dependent on a single foreign customer. By the late 70s, almost half of everything the factory made was being shipped to Nigeria. It was fine business while it lasted. It did not last. When the Nigerian government cancelled its import licenses, half the output of the works suddenly had nowhere in the world to go, and 500 people at Tanfield Lea lost their jobs. The first real wound, not inflicted by a rival, not by any new technology, but by the plain fragility of having staked so much on one distant, borrowed market. A factory built in the coalfield to give the coalfield security had just shown how quickly that security could be taken away by a decision made in Lagos. Nobody at the works had any say in it at all. And a venture in Hong Kong, a factory set up out there but run from an office back in England, simply failed. But the strangest decision of all came in 1978, and it still reads, decades later, like a deliberate act of self-harm. The company changed its name. For more than 70 years it had been Eveready. That name had done something almost no brand ever manages. It had become the ordinary English word for the thing itself. When a torch went dim, people didn't say they needed a new battery. They said they needed an Eveready. It was worth more than any single factory the company owned, and they threw it away. They renamed the whole group BEREC from an old export acronym, British Eveready Export Company, because somebody in a boardroom had concluded that BEREC sounded more international, more modern, more suited to a company with ambitions across the world. It sounded like nothing. It meant nothing to the woman at the corner shop counter asking for batteries for her son's torch. They had taken the single most valuable word in the whole enterprise, a word every household in the country already carried in its head, and swapped it for 4 letters that nobody could love or even quite remember. And while Eveready, while BEREC, was busy mislaying its own name, Duracell was busy taking its market. The American brand did, methodically, everything the British company would not do. It sold the long life story hard, and it sold it everywhere. It pushed its batteries into the new supermarkets on hooks and blister packs by the tills, right where a shopper's hand would fall, while Eveready clung to the old wholesale trade and the corner shop counter it had always known, protecting its habits, protecting its relationships, protecting everything except its position. Duracell offered the big retailers the terms they wanted. Eveready offered them tradition, and the result was not close. Duracell went from a sliver of the British market at the end of the 70s to better than 30% of it within a decade. When Eveready at last put an alkaline battery of its own on the shelf, the Gold Seal, it never took much more than 1/5 of the alkaline trade it had itself pioneered. The company that had built a working British alkaline cell in 1973 now stood, 10 years later, a fading second in the very market it ought to have owned outright. The company was not idle, exactly. It had opened a new alkaline factory at Newburn, over near Newcastle, at the end of the 70s. It had developed a cleaner zinc chloride cell at Tanfield Lea and given it the name Silver Seal. But these were hedges, half measures, bets each way, a little alkaline here, an improved version of the old chemistry there, from a company that could not quite bring itself to choose. It kept one hand on the past and one hand on the future and committed fully to neither, and in a fast-moving market that is the one posture guaranteed to lose. The men who ran it had spent their whole careers being right simply by standing still. Standing still had worked for 80 years. They did not seem to notice the ground had begun to move beneath them. So here was the picture at the turn of the decade. A company fat with cash and short on nerve, anchored to a dying product, distant second in the coming one. Its laboratories still clever, its dominance still real on paper, but its momentum gone and its judgment curdled by too many easy years. To the public, it still looked like a national institution, as permanent as ever. But to a certain kind of buyer, the sort who read a balance sheet the way a butcher reads a carcass, seeing not the animal but the cuts, it did not look like an institution at all. It looked like a meal. Chapter 7. The Cash Registers. The buyer, when he came came from a place not 30 miles from the Durham coalfield, though he had long since left it behind for a rather grander life. James Hanson, Lord Hanson, was a Yorkshireman who, together with his partner Sir Gordon White, had built one of the most feared corporate machines in Britain, the Hanson Trust. The two of them made an odd and effective pair. White, working largely out of America, was the strategist who planned and directed the raids. Hanson was the front, the public face, the peer with the drawling confidence. And what the Hanson Trust did was not, in the main, make things. What it did was buy companies that made things. The method was consistent, and to its admirers, it was a kind of genius. You found a solid old company sitting on undervalued assets and comfortable habits. You bought it, often against its will. Then you sold off the pieces, a subsidiary here, a division there, until the sales had paid back most of what you'd spent buying it in the first place. You cut the overheads, you cut the research, which cost money now and paid off only later, if at all, and you kept whatever cash-generating core was left, and you ran it hard for profit. Over its life, the Hanson Trust would make dozens of acquisitions and very nearly as many disposals. It was less a company, in the ordinary sense, than a place through which other companies passed on their way to being taken apart. None of this was hidden. None of it was illegal. It was, in the language of the day, simply good business. The market working as the market was meant to work, moving assets from the sleepy hands that held them into the sharp hands that could wring more from them. Hanson and White were not pirates. They were celebrated. They were knighted and ennobled. They were held up in the boardrooms and the business pages of the 1980s as everything a modern British company ought to be. And to a firm like Ever-Ready, cash-rich, complacent, sitting on a fading monopoly it had not the nerve to defend, a firm like the Hanson Trust was not an aberration. It was the natural predator that a creature that had stopped running was always, eventually, going to attract. And in the summer of 1981, it turned its attention to Berwick. It began, as these things did, before anyone at the company had a chance to draw breath. A dawn raid, Hanson's brokers moving through the market at first light, buying up around 15% of Berwick's shares before the board had finished its morning tea. The chairman of Berwick was a man named Colin Stapleton, and years afterwards he described that morning with a candour that tells you everything about how little control he had. "Your stockbroker rings," he said, "and tells you Hanson is going to bid, and, in his own unforgettable phrase, you hear the cash registers start ringing." That sound was the sound of his shareholders realising they were about to be made rich, and of his company being sold out from under him, all at once. Stapleton fought. There was resistance, and by his account even a rival approach. But the outcome, once those cash registers had started, was never truly in doubt. As he put it himself, "At the end of the day you have little choice. It is the city's decision, not yours. The owners of a public company are not the workers who make its products or the managers who run its factories. They are the shareholders, and the shareholders wanted the money." Stapleton understood exactly what was being lost, and he said so, in words that have outlived the whole affair. "If you want an industry for your grandchildren," he warned, "you don't let Hanson anywhere near it." But wanting an industry for your grandchildren was not, in 1981, a thing the city was in the business of pricing. It priced the next result, the next dividend, the next year. The grandchildren did not have a vote. By the turn of the year it was done. The Hanson Trust had bought the whole of Berwick, the entire Ever-Ready empire, its factories and its laboratories and its continental subsidiaries and its 90-year-old name, for £95 million. And then Hanson did something that, at the time, looked almost like an act of respect. One of his very first decisions was to throw out the name Berwick and bring back the old one. Ever-Ready returned to the packets, to the shop shelves, to the fronts of the torches. To a watching public, it seemed a sign that the new owner understood what he'd bought, that he valued the heritage, that the institution was in safe hands. It was nothing of the kind. It was simply good sense. The name Ever-Ready still sold batteries, and Berwick did not, and Hanson had not paid £95 million to leave money on the counter. He kept the word because the word was worth keeping. What he did with everything standing behind the word was another matter entirely. Chapter 8. What a company is worth in pieces. Here is the thing about buying a company in order to sell it for parts. You have to actually sell the parts, and the parts of Ever-Ready were, one after another, exactly the things that made it a battery company with a future rather than a battery company with a past. The great research laboratory at Tottenham, the place in North London where the company's chemists had built that long-life alkaline cell back in 1973, the place where the future had literally been invented and then filed away, was closed. Its work, what remained of it, was moved north to Tanfield Lea. The Advanced Projects Group down at Abingdon, the small team quietly working on the batteries of the next century, on bromine and on lithium, was sold off. Lithium, the chemistry that would, within a generation, come to power every telephone and every laptop and every electric car on Earth. A British team had been working on it, and the company sold them, because a research team that spends money today against a payoff 20 years off is, on a spreadsheet drawn up to recoup a purchase price, nothing but a cost with no matching column. The company was disposing of its own tomorrow to help pay for its yesterday. Then came the sale that has a particular sting to it, even now. The continental subsidiaries that Eveready had spent decades acquiring, Daimon, the proud old German name, Superpila in Italy, were sold, and they were sold, of all the buyers in the world, to Duracell, the arch-rival. The company that was already eating Eveready alive in its home market was handed, for cash, the very continental factories and footholds it needed to grow. Somewhere, someone worked out that the German and Italian businesses were worth more as checks than as companies, and signed them over to the one competitor who could do the most damage with them. It was a rational decision. Each of these decisions was rational. That is what makes them so hard to watch. And the people, the consumer battery workforce, which had stood at around 2,900, was cut to 2,000. 900 jobs, gone from the figures in a boardroom, each one of them a wage packet and a mortgage and a family somewhere in the country. At Tanfield Lea, 314 jobs out of some 940 were shed, a third of the works, in the community that had the least to fall back on, the community that had already lost the pits and taken the battery jobs as its lifeline. The men who had come off the coal and been given 20 good years found that the new owner counted them not as a workforce, but as a line on an account, and lines on accounts are things you reduce. The alkaline battery that might have saved the whole enterprise still sat unbuilt, because building it would have meant spending, and the entire point of the exercise was not to spend, but to extract. The local Member of Parliament would later put the whole decade into a single, quiet, devastating sentence. Under Hanson's ownership, the works and its workforce were run down. Not destroyed in a dramatic stroke, run down, worn away, managed carefully towards an end. And then, in 1992, the last act of the Hanson years arrived, and with it, a symmetry so exact it feels almost cruel. Hanson sold the British Eveready business. He sold it to the American Ralston Purina Company, and Ralston Purina, since 1986, had owned the old American Eveready, the very company, the very lineage, that the British firm had cut itself loose from all the way back around 1904. Consider that fully. For nearly 90 years, the British Eveready had stood on its own, independent, floated on the London Exchange in 1914, master of its own name, a genuinely British institution that had merely shared an origin with an American cousin and then gone its separate way. And now, after all of it, after 2 world wars survived and a blitz endured and a coalfield rescued, it was simply sold back. The independence that had defined it for a lifetime was ended in a boardroom transaction measured in assets and liabilities. The price was £132 million. For the Hanson Trust, which had paid $95 million of 11 years before and stripped and sold a great deal in between, the deal is reckoned to have turned a profit of something over $100 million. The name had come from America at the very beginning, and now, in the end, it had gone home. Nobody in Tanfield Lea was told that this was what it meant. Hanson was not quite finished either. There was still the South African arm of the old empire to dispose of, and in time that too would be sold. To Duracell again, for something in the region of £120 million. Piece by piece, over a decade, the battery empire that a company had spent 70 years assembling was unbuilt and sold across a boardroom table, and a great deal of it ended up in the hands of the one rival best placed to profit from the whole affair. The Hanson Trust had done exactly what the Hanson Trust always did, and done it well, and moved on to the next carcass. There was no malice in it. That is almost the worst of it. There was no malice in it at all, only arithmetic. Chapter 9. The Bombshell. The new American owner had a global map to fill in, and Tanfield Lea did not fit it. The signs, in truth, had been there even before the Americans arrived. Back in 1988, the closure of the Four Ashes works near Wolverhampton, the plant that made the carbon electrodes, had already been announced. The old British battery-making country, the Midlands sprawl of torch and cell factories that Eveready had spent the 20s and 30s buying up, was being wound in. But under the new ownership, the winding in became a landslide. The rationalising began almost at once. The alkaline factory at Newburn, near Newcastle, underinvested, its costs higher than the American company's vast alkaline plants over in France and Switzerland, was closed in 1992. Its workforce fell from 205 to 30. The factories at Telford and at Wolverhampton, the old torch and battery heartland, closed too. Zinc carbon production in Britain all but stopped. The cheap batteries that carried the Blue Seal name began arriving instead from Indonesia. Tanfield Lea held on. For a few more years it survived by making the zinc chloride silver seal cells, and it even developed a new battery for the German market. The men kept coming in. The lines kept running. They were told the works had a place in the company's international plans. In 1993, Giles Radice, the member for North Durham, came up to Tanfield Lea to help mark the factory's 25th anniversary. There were the usual celebrations, and the management of Eveready International, he later recalled, assured him that day that the plant had a bright future. The bombshell came on the 17th of January, 1996. 350 jobs. The company announced that Tanfield Lea would close, and Radice, who had shaken hands over that bright future barely 2 years earlier, stood up in the House of Commons and told the story plainly, because it was the only thing left he could do for them. He laid the whole history out in a single breath. The works had been opened by Anthony Crosland under the regional policy of its day. It had been taken over by Hanson, and under that ownership, the works and its people had been run down. Then it had been sold to the international company, which had assured his constituents that Tanfield Lea would be integral to its plans, right up until the day it dropped the bombshell. He had gone to the company and begged. He had asked them to switch the works over to making alkaline batteries. The batteries there was actually a growing market for. The batteries Eveready's own chemists had built more than 20 years before. The company refused. It spoke, instead of a change in worldwide strategy, of the necessities of the global market. Zinc carbon batteries, it explained, were being replaced by long-life ones across Western Europe, and the demand that remained in Asia and Latin America could be met more efficiently by its so-called super factories in those regions. It was, the company insisted, no reflection on the workforce, for whom it had nothing but praise, and no work. And there was a logic to what the company said. There always is. Zinc carbon batteries really were being replaced by long-life ones across the wealthy markets of Western Europe, the very shift Eveready's own chemists had seen coming a quarter of a century before. The demand that remained really was drifting to Asia and Latin America, and really could be served more cheaply by enormous modern plants built close to those customers. A works in a Durham valley, making an old-fashioned cell for a shrinking European market, did not fit that picture. On a map of the world drawn in a boardroom, Tanfield Lea was simply in the wrong place, making the wrong thing at the wrong cost. Every word of it was true, and every word of it was cold comfort to a man of 48 who had given the works his whole adult life and was now being thanked for it and shown the gate. The cruelty was in the timing more than the reasoning. The men had been told 2 years before that they had a future. They had celebrated a quarter century of the works with the assurance ringing in their ears. And what makes the plea Radice took to the company so hard to forget is what he asked for. He did not ask for a subsidy or a bailout or a favour. He asked them to build the alkaline battery, the modern battery, the one there was a market for, the one Eveready's own laboratory had invented back in 1973 and then declined to make. The answer, after 23 years, was still no. The future had been available to this company since before Tanfield Lea's workers had grown their first grey hairs, and at every turning point, by every owner, it had been set aside for the safer, cheaper, more immediate thing. The place did not empty all at once. A small unit of around 40 people was kept on for a while, making the little zinc cups and the liner papers that the surviving factories elsewhere still needed, along with a handful of research staff. Radice suspected, rightly that this was only a temporary measure, a stay of execution, not a reprieve. For the rest, the end came shift by shift. A man who had started at the works as a boy in 68 was, by 96, coming up for retirement anyway. But a man who had started at 20 was 48 now, too old, in the cold reckoning of the northeast jobs market, to be wanted, too young to stop. They cleared their lockers. They handed back their overalls, grey with a decade or two of carbon dust that would never quite wash out. They said the things men say to each other when there is nothing to be done, and no point saying so. And so, the works that Anthony Crosland had opened to such fanfare in 1968, the works that had given the sons of miners 28 years of a wage and a purpose, the largest battery factory Europe had once been able to boast, fell quiet. A factory that has run day and night for decades has a sound to it, the machines, the movement of hundreds of people, the endless low hum of a place that never stops. When that stops, what you notice is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of a silence in the wrong shape, filling a building that was never built to hold it. The lines that had told the coalfield what o'clock it was, told it nothing now. Chapter 10. The Long After. The other Durham member, Hilary Armstrong, spoke in that same debate, and she gave the loss its true measure, because she knew that Tanfield Lea was not the first blow the area had taken, only the latest. This was a corner of the country that had already lost its collieries, that had lost the great Consett steelworks at the start of the 80s, and now it was losing its batteries too. Armstrong spoke of the men, and it was mostly men, who had not worked since they lost those earlier jobs, and who now, in all likelihood, never would again. The ones in their early 50s especially, too old in the brutal arithmetic of the labour market, to be started again, and too young to simply stop. Each closure had taken a layer, and there were not many layers left. The response was the response these places had learned to expect. A task force was reconvened, the same kind of body that had been set up after Consett, bringing together the district council, the local development agency, the training people, the government's own departments, all turning their attention to retraining and to finding new work and to reclaiming the site. And reclaiming this site meant something particular. You cannot simply knock down a factory that spent nearly 30 years handling zinc and manganese and ammonium chloride. First, you have to make the ground safe again. The very chemistry that had made the batteries had soaked, over the decades, into the earth beneath them, and it would have to be dug out and carried away before anything new could stand there. Even in leaving, the works left a mark that had to be cleaned up. The government could point to real things. There were regional grants and regeneration budgets, and the £100 million Project Genesis scheme that was already remaking the old Consett steel site up the road. There was new investment coming into the wider region, Fujitsu, a Japanese glass company, the promise of a different kind of future, one built on electronics and foreign capital rather than coal and steel and cells. Some of it worked, some of it helped. But a grant is not a works, and a retraining scheme is not the thing a man's father did, and the thing his father did before that. You can teach a fitter of 50 new skills. You cannot easily give him back the particular dignity of walking to a gate every morning, to a job that his son might have followed him into. That was the thing that had been lost, and no budget line could quite replace it. As for the factory itself, it did what these buildings do. It stood empty. For close to 2 decades, the great works at Tanfield Lea sat derelict, weathering, its windows going, the car park that had once filled and emptied to the rhythm of the shifts cracking and greening over, nature moving quietly back into a space that had been built to keep it out. Budlayer in the gutters, rain where the roofs failed, a vast silent shed slowly returning to the moor it had been raised on. Not until around 2016 did the demolition begin, the buildings finally coming down to clear the brownfield ground for something new. By late 2023, there was planning approval on the site. For housing, around 143 homes, where the largest battery factory in Europe had once poured out its millions of cells. And the brand, the blue and red name that had meant battery to every household in the land, not a single ever-ready battery is made in Britain today. The name belongs now to an American company, to Energizer, the corporate descendant of that very ever-ready lineage the British firm had parted from more than a century ago. The word came from America, and in the end, The word went back to America and took the making with it. What's left in Tanfield Lea is memory, mostly, held in local history, in the records of the county, in the great open-air museum at Beamish, just a few miles off, which keeps the oral history of this coalfield and the lives that were lived in it. The men who worked the battery line are getting older now. Their children remember the works. Their grandchildren may only know that there used to be something there before the houses. Chapter 11. What remains? There is probably an ever-ready battery somewhere in your house even now. In the back of a drawer, in an old torch, in a radio nobody plays. Flat, most likely. Long dead, the blue and red barrel gone a little dull. You would think nothing of it. That was always the point of the thing. It asked to be forgotten. It did its quiet work in the dark, and it never expected thanks. But somebody made it. Somebody in County Durham, the son of a miner most likely, drew that zinc into a can and packed that black core and sealed that cell, one of millions, on a line that ran through the night while the coalfields slept. And that man was proud of it, in the way that part of the country is proud of things, which is to say, without ever once saying so. The story of Everready is not the story of a company that failed. That is what makes it hard. It did not go under because its product was bad, or its workers were idle, or its factories couldn't compete. It made a fine product that the whole country wanted. It invented, in its own laboratory, the very battery that would replace the one it sold. It survived 2 world wars, and a bombing and a depression, and the loss of the coal and the steel all around it. What undid it was none of those things. What undid it was a long series of reasonable decisions, made by careful men in rooms far from Tanfield Lea, each one defensible on its own, each one adding a little more weight to the wrong side of the scale. Sell the stake in the future. Keep the name, sell the substance. Ship the cheap work to Indonesia and the good work to America. Manage the works down, gently, until the day comes to manage it away. No villain twirled a moustache. No single catastrophe struck. That is the harder truth, and the sadder one, that a thing this solid, this woven into the ordinary life of a nation, could be undone not by one great blow, but by 1,000 small subtractions, until one January morning there was simply nothing left to subtract. The coalfield lost its pits, then it lost its steel, then it lost the works that had been built to replace them, and the batteries that had powered a country from a drawer, from a torch, from a wireless on a shelf. The batteries that had asked only to be forgotten got, in the end, exactly what they'd always asked for.